John Paul Jones. Narrative of the Campaign of the Liman. From original letters and manuscripts in the possession of Miss Janet Taylor. New York, 1830. Read by Nikolai Sveshnikov. Avant-propos of the Rear Admiral. The United States of America, having charged me with a mission of a political nature to the court of Denmark, and having at the same time furnished me with a letter to deliver personally to His Most Christian Majesty Louis XVI, I embarked at New York on the 11th of November 1787 in an American vessel bound for Holland, the captain of which agreed to land me in France. After a voyage of a month, I landed at Dover in England, not being able to get ashore in France. From Dover, I went to London, where I saw the Minister of the United States. I passed some days with my friends there and went to Covent Garden Theatre. I afterwards set out for Paris, where I arrived on the 20th of December. Mr. Jefferson, the ambassador of the United States, visited me on the night of my arrival and informed me that Monsieur de Semolin, Minister Plenipotentiary of Her Imperial Majesty of all the Russias, had often spoken of me whilst I was in America, and appeared anxious to succeed in prevailing me to go to Russia to command the fleet against the Turks in the Black Sea. I regarded this proposal as a castle in the air, and as I did not wish for any employment in foreign service, I avoided meeting Monsieur de Semolin, for whose character I had at the same time the highest respect. As the letter, of which I was the bearer to the King of France, concerned myself alone, my friends advised me not to seek an interview with His Majesty before my return from Denmark. In that letter, the United States requested His Majesty to permit me to embark in his fleet of evolutions to complete my knowledge of naval tactics and of military and maritime operations upon the great scale. Speaking to a man of very high rank in Paris, I repeated to him what had been communicated to me by Mr. Jefferson. He replied that he would advise me to go to Constantinople at once, rather than enter the service of Russia. On the 1st of February 1788, at the moment of my departure from Paris, I received a note from Monsieur Littlepage, Chamberlain to the King of Poland, earnestly requesting me to breakfast with him next morning, as he had matters of the utmost importance to communicate to me. I went to him that same night, and he told me that Monsieur de Semolin had the greatest desire to converse with me before my departure, and that he calculated on breakfasting with us next day. Monsieur de Semolin said the most polite and obliging things to me. Then, having known me well by reputation whilst he was ambassador in England, and since he had come to France, he had already proposed me to his sovereign as a commander of the fleet in the Black Sea, etc., and that he expected Her Imperial Majesty would make me proposals in consequence. I did not yet look upon the affairs as serious, but I was much flattered with the politeness of Monsieur de Semolin, and endeavored to express to him my sense of it. When he had left the house, Mr. Littlepage assured me that he had written to his court that if Your Imperial Majesty confined to me the chief command of your fleet on the Black Sea, with carte blanche, he would answer for it that in less than a year I should make Constantinople tremble. In Denmark, I put in train a treaty between that power and the United States, but it was interrupted by the arrival of a courier from St. Petersburg dispatched express by the Empress to invite me to repair to her court. Though I foresaw many difficulties in the way of my entering the service of Russia, I believed that I could not avoid going to St. Petersburg to thank the Empress for the favorable opinion she had conceived of me. I transferred the treaty going forward at Copenhagen to Paris, to be concluded there, and set out for St. Petersburg by Sweden. At Stockholm, I stayed but one night to see Count Razumovsky. Want of time prevented me from appearing at court. At Grasholm I was stopped by the ice, which prevented me from crossing the Gulf of Bothnia, and even from approaching the first of the isles in the passage. After having made several unsuccessful efforts to get to Finland by the isles, I imagined that it might be practicable to effect my object by doubling the ice to the southward and entering the Baltic Sea. This enterprise was very daring, and had never been attempted. But by the north the roads were impracticable, and knowing that the Empress expected me from day to day, I could not think of going back to Elsinore. I left Grasholm early morning in an undecked passage boat with 30 feet in length. I made another boat follow of half that size. This last one was for dragging over the cakes of ice and for passing from one to another to gain the coast of Finland. I durst not make my project known to the boatmen, which would have been the sure means of deterring them from it. After endeavoring as before to gain the first isle, I made them steer for the south, and we kept along the coast of Sweden all the day, finding with difficulties room enough to pass between the ice and the shore. Towards night, being almost opposite Stockholm, pistol in hand, I forced the boatman to enter the Baltic Sea and steer to the east. We ran towards the coast of Finland. All night the wind was fair, and we hoped to land next day. This we found impossible. The ice did not permit us to approach the shore, which we only saw from a distance. It was impossible to regain the Swedish side, the wind being strong and directly contrary. I had no other course to adopt but to make for the Gulf of Finland. There was a small compass in the boat, and I fixed the lamp of my traveling carriage so as to throw a light on it. On the second night we lost the small boat, which was sunk, but the men saved themselves in the large one, which with difficulty escaped the same fate. At the end of 4 days we landed at Rival in Livonia, which was regarded as a kind of miracle. Having satisfied the boatmen for their services and their loss, I gave them a good pilot with the provisions necessary for making their homeward voyage when the weather should become more favorable. I arrived at St. Petersburg in the evening on the 23rd of April, old style, and on the 25th had my first audience of the Empress. Her Majesty gave me so flattering a reception, and up to the period of my departure treated me with so much distinction that I was entirely captivated, and put myself into her hands without making any stipulation for my personal advantage. I demanded by one favor, that she would never condemn without hearing me. On the 7th of May I set out from the imperial palace of Tsarskoye Selo, carrying me with a letter from Her Majesty to His Highness the Prince Marshal Potemkin at St. Elizabeth, where I arrived on the 19th. The Prince Marshal received me with much kindness and destined me the command of the fleet of Sebastopol against the Captain Pasha, who he supposed intended to make descents in the Crimea. His brightness was mistaken in this, and the next day he received information that the Captain Pasha was at anchor within Kinburn, having come to secure Achakov with 120 armed vessels and other armed craft. The Prince Marshal then requested me to assure command of the naval force stationed in the Liman, which is at the embouchure of the Dnieper, to act against the Captain Pasha till Achakov should fall. I considered this change as a mark of confidence flattering to myself, and having received my orders, I set out on the same day for Kherson, accompanied with Chevalier de Ribes, Brigadier du Jour of the Prince Marshal. He was ordered to make all the arrangements necessary to place me in command. At parting, the Prince Marshal promised me to bring forward his troops without loss of time, to cooperate with the maritime force he had entrusted to my command. And on the journey, Monsieur de Ribes told me that all the force of the Liman, comprehending that of the Prince of Nassau, would be under my orders. I spent but one evening at night at Kherson, but even this short period was enough to show that I had entered on a critical and disagreeable service. Rear Admiral Mordvinov, Chief of the Admiralty, did not affect to disguise his displeasure at my arrival, and though he had orders from the Prince Marshal to communicate to me all the details concerning the force in the Liman, and to put me in possession of the silk flag belonging to my rank as Rear Admiral, he gave himself not the least trouble to comply therewith. We set out early next morning for Gluboka, the armament of the Liman being at anchor very near that place, in the roads of Shirokoi, between the bar of the Dnieper and the embouchure of the river Bug. We went on board the Vladimir before midday, where we found that Brigadier Alexiano had assembled all the commanders to draw them into a cabal against my authority. I may mention here that this man was a Greek by birth, as ignorant of seamanship as of military affairs, who under an exterior and manners the most gross concealed infinite cunning, and by an impertinent roughness of discourse had to address to pass for a blunt, honest man. Though a subject of Turkey, it was alleged that he made war with the Mussulmans by attacking their commerce in the archipelago on his own authority, and that he had followed this means of enriching himself up to the period that Count Darlov arrived with the Russian fleet. Though I do not affirm the fact, several persons of credit have assured me that there are often pirates who infest the coast, and the isles between Constantinople and Egypt who attack the commerce of all nations, and run down the vessels after having seized the cargoes and cut the throats of the crews. Alexiana had been employed by Count Darlov. He had reached the grade of Captain de Hautebord with the rank of brigadier. He felt his spirits ruffled in the first instance, and afterwards made great merit with the Prince Marshal of the sacrifice which he affected to make in serving under me. He said that if he withdrew, all the other officers would do the same. The Prince Marshal sent presents to his wife and wrote him kindly, persuading him to remain in the service. All the objections he made were bravadoes, to enable himself to make something out of the difficulty. From what followed, I know that had he left the service, it would have been alone, and that no one would have regretted his absence. To give time to those angry spirits to become calm, and to be able to decide on the part I should take, I proposed to Brigadier de Ribes that we should together make a journey to Kinburn to see the entrance of Dnieper and reconnoiter the position and strength of the Turkish fleet and flotilla. At my return, all the officers appeared contented, and I hoisted my flag on board the Vladimir on the 26th of May, 1788. The Prince of Nassau Ziegin, whom I had known slightly at Paris, told me that if we gained any advantage over the Turks, it would be necessary to exaggerate it to the utmost, and that this was the counsel the Chevalier de Ribas had given him. I replied that I never had adopted that method of making myself of consequence. Extract of a journal of the campaign in the Liman in 1788. At the opening of this campaign, the squadron of Kherson was obliged to remain for 2 days in the road of Shirokaya, till the troops should embark, which were to form part of the crew. The Prince of Nassau, who had been appointed commander of the flotilla and who had by this time received on board the troops intended for him, durst not venture to advance 4 or 5 versts to take station opposite to the Bug, without being escorted by 3 frigates. The Prince of Nassau made so many objections to the danger of his situation that on the 28th of May, the day following, Rear Admiral Chevalier Paul Jones, commander of the squadron, reinforced him with a 4th frigate. On the 29th, the troop being all on board, the squadron advanced and got beyond the flotilla, which lay scattered about at anchor without any observance of order. The squadron drew up opposite the first village to the west of the Bug in an obtuse angle, and thus commanded by a crossfire the only passage of the Liman. This lies between 2 sandbanks through which the Turks must advance their heavy vessels. By this position, the Rear Admiral covered Kherson and the country on both banks of the Liman, made good for free passage of the Bug to the army of the Prince Marshal, and held the Turks in check in any attempt they might make against Kinburn. The Prince of Nassau at this time talked a great deal of projects of descent, surprises and attacks, but without any rational plan. A battery having been raised upon the point of Stanislaus, the Prince of Nassau could not help exclaiming that he was delighted with it, as in case of necessity he might there find shelter. He was not ignorant that the Rear Admiral could not have retreated, as several of his vessels were already within a few inches of getting aground. The Rear Admiral was aware that the Turks, having a very superior force, would not give any opportunity of attacking them, and that it was therefore necessary to maintain the strong position he had taken, till the arrival of Prince Potemkin, in order to advance in concert and combine their operations with those of the land forces. In the meanwhile, General Suvorov, commandant of Kinburn, made the Rear Admiral responsible for the safety of that place, while Brigadier Alexiano and the Prince of Nassau, on their part, did all that was possible to make him distrustful of the means which he possessed to attack or defense. They alleged that the vessels forming the flotilla, having been constructed merely to convey the carriages of the Empress in her late progress, might be expected at the first attack to sink under the enormous weight of the guns. The squadron had a formidable appearance but little real strength. The Vladimir and Alexander were by half armed, and both vessels were already within a few inches of touching the bottom, so shallow in the Liman for vessels of war. In this most critical situation, having no orders from His Highness the Prince Marshal for his guidance, and knowing nothing of his intentions, nor of the actual position of his army, the Rear Admiral resolved on assembling a council of war in conformity to the ordinance of Peter the Great. The council he opened by a speech suited to the occasion, the main object of which was to show the necessity of a perfect understanding between the squadron and the flotilla, and that uniting heart and hand, forgetting all personal considerations, they should determine to conquer, as a true glory of a patriot was to be useful to his country. He proposed to them 9 questions. It was decided to act together, mingle together in one and the same order of battle. That if the wind should be from a point from north to southeast, the prince should detach a part of the flotilla at 1 a.m. and should be supported at daybreak by the squadron of the Rear Admiral to cut off the retreat of the enemy's small craft, which were near the first village east of Achakov, and that the best position for the squadron and flotilla in the Liman to cover Kinburn and act on the defensive until the approach of the army under Prince Potemkin was 4 versts farther in advance, opposite the first village east of Achakov in a straight line, north-northeast, south-southwest. The batteries in the space between the ships and a corps of reserves composed of a division of the flotilla to cover the right wing. The council was to have met again next day to decide on the other points which the Rear Admiral had to propose, among which was the best manner of attack and defense and the general arrangement of signals, which ought all, in his opinion, to be made on board of the same vessel. But Monsieur de Nassau and the Brigadier Alexiana opposed this, and the council did not reassemble as proposed. On the 6th of June at 2 in the morning, the Prince of Nassau advanced, as had been previously agreed on, with the greater part of the flotilla, but in place of cutting off the retreat of the vessels forming the enemy's advanced guard, he retired at daybreak before a very inferior force and without offering the smallest resistance. And the Turks chased him, keeping up a cannonade into the midst of the squadron which had advanced to take the position assigned to them. The precipitate retreat of the Prince of Nassau inspirited the Turks so much that during the night between the 6th and 7th they drew up their flotilla in 2 divisions in a shallow close by their own shore. The first of these divisions had by day dawn advanced within cannon shot of our reserve, which had been posted the previous night on the right wing. At sunrise the Turks made sail, and Brigadier Alexiano ran upon the deck of Vladimir half naked, exclaiming like a frantic man in French and Russian that the Turks were going to attack and board us, and that we would be blown to pieces for having been so foolish as to leave our former position. He had, notwithstanding, in the council of war, given his voice in favor of the position we now actually hold. Brigadier Ribas, the captain, and all the crew were witnesses to his extravagant and unjustifiable behavior. This proving a false alarm, the Turkish fleet did not stir. The Prince of Nassau came on board the Vladimir, and the Rear Admiral proposed to him to reconnoiter the enemy's fleet and flotilla. As they advanced together, the first division of the Turkish flotilla began to fire from their canoes and raised their anchors and row it forward towards our reserve, which they attacked briskly. At the same time, several corps of Turkish troops advanced along the opposite bank, as if they intended to establish a post or battery to act on our flank. As our reserve had been posted to cover our right wing, the Prince of Nassau, who knew not what to do, proposed to make it draw up in the form of crochet d'oulet, the better to sustain the assault. The Rear Admiral told him that on the contrary it was necessary to leave the anchors with the utmost dispatch and to form in line of battle to meet the attack of the Turks. The combat having commenced according to this plan, the Rear Admiral hastened along our line to issue orders to the squadron, and above all to make the remainder of the flotilla posted between the ships and upon the left wing advance. The wind being adverse, he made these vessels be towed by the ship's boats and other boats attached to the squadron, and by an oblique movement formed in front line with the intention of cutting off the retreat of the enemy and galling him by a crossfire. As soon as the Captain Pasha perceived the maneuver of the Rear Admiral, he came forward himself in his kirlangich, having a very favorable wind, and made the second division of his flotilla advance. At this time our reserve was very critically situated. A double chaloupe quitted the action, and 4 of our galleys were in danger of being captured. The Prince of Nassau, who did not relish going himself, sent Brigadier Korsakov, who made them retreat. Instead of remaining with the reserve, which being without a commander was in very great disorder, the Prince of Nassau quitted his own post and stationed himself before the Rear Admiral, where he could be of no use whatever. The Rear Admiral went into the same boat with the Prince of Nassau and again issued his orders along the line. Being now within cannon shot of the enemy, he opened fire, advancing always in an oblique line to cut off his retreat. At the same time he dispatched Brigadier Alexiano to endeavor to rally the vessels of the reserve, which the Prince of Nassau had deserted. But Alexiano contented himself with waving his hat in the air and shouting from behind the lines, "Fire, my boys, on the kirlangich of the Captain Pasha." When the line led on by the Rear Admiral came to close fire with the enemy, their flotilla was thrown into the utmost confusion. Our reserve gave no farther way, and the enemy was placed under a crossfire. The Captain Pasha availed himself of the only resource he had left. The wind being in his favor, he set every sail to withdraw his force. Had he remained a half hour longer, he would have been surrounded. 2 of his vessels were burned in this affair. The flotilla of the enemy was composed of 57 vessels, and we chased them up to their fleet. The Rear Admiral, who had directed the whole affair, left all the credit of it to the Prince of Nassau. An idea may be formed on the capacity of this prince from the circumstance that at the beginning of this action he requested the Rear Admiral to bring forward to the support of the reserve only the vessels posted on the left wing, which consisted of one galley and two double shaloops. Besides the insufficiency of force, these vessels had a very long way to make, and that against the wind. The Turks remained quiet for some time after this. The Prince of Nassau, who had scarce spoken one word during the affair, saved to make extravagant professions of regard of the Rear Admiral, who began to give himself airs. On the 13th of June he addressed in writing of an extraordinary character to the Rear Admiral, the object of which appeared to be that an advance should be made of 3 versts near the enemy, who had taken post under the batteries of Ochakov. The Rear Admiral, who could perceive no advantage to this service in such a movement, refused his concurrence. The Prince Marshal, having approved his plan of acting on the defensive until the arrival of the land forces, or at least until the moment when the Turks might afford us an opportunity of attacking them to advantage. Had he agreed, the movement would have been fatal to Russia, as will be seen by what follows. By the 16th of June, the patience of Captain Pasha was exhausted. He brought from his grand fleet without Kinburn 2,000 picked men to reinforce the body under the walls of Ochakov, and being strengthened still further by the troops of the garrison, he advanced with his whole fleet and flotilla and with a fair wind into the Liman to attack and board us. The ship was bore one of the admiral's flag, steered right towards the Vladimir from the commencement of the movement. When within 2 versts of us, or little more, the ship got aground, and all the vessels which accompanied it immediately dropped anchor. It was then about 2 in the afternoon. The Rear Admiral summoned the Council of War to consult on what should be done. He addressed the council at which were present all the commanders of the squadron and the flotilla, and concluded by telling them that they must make up their minds to conquer or die for their country. The wind, which was rather fresh, being against us, the only thing proposed by the Rear Admiral that was found practicable was to draw up our force in an obtuse angle by bringing forward by anchors the right of the line up to the center. This movement was completed before midnight. The wind had shifted to north-northeast, and at break of day on the 17th the Rear Admiral made signal, and the whole squadron immediately set sail to commence the attack on the Turks. The Turks got into confusion the instant this maneuver was perceived. They raised their anchors or cut their cables with the greatest precipitation, and not the shadow of order remained in their fleet. Our squadron advanced in line of battle with an imposing and formidable appearance, so that the Turks knew not how weak it really was. As our flotilla had been very slow in weighing anchor, the Rear Admiral was obliged to make the squadron halt twice to wait for it. At length, the flotilla being always last, the squadron opened fire on the enemy, of whom the person second in command, who had flown about like a fool, quickly ran his ship on a sand bank on the south of the Liman. There was no longer hope for him. From the moment he grounded, he was ours. The enemy still kept flying about and always in the greatest disorder. The Rear Admiral ordered his ship, the Vladimir, to be steered to within pistol shot of the vessel of the Captain Pasha, but the latter again ran aground upon a sandbank. And a few minutes afterwards, the Brigadier Alexiano gave orders in the Russian language and unknown to the Rear Admiral to drop the Vladimir's anchor. It was pretended that there were but 15 feet of water a little way in advance of the ship, which was not true. A considerable time before this, the squadron had been taken on the right flank by the Turkish flotilla drawn up in the shallows, near the bank of the east of Ochakov and commanded by the Captain Pasha himself. The flotilla annoyed the squadron considerably by incessantly throwing in along our line both bombs and balls of great size. Wanting depth of water, our frigates could not advance far enough to dislodge them, and besides they found that their guns were too small. The Captain Pasha sunk one of our frigates, named the Little Alexander, by a bomb at the side of the Vladimir, and at the very instant Brigadier Alexiano made the anchor be cast. Our flotilla still lagged behind, but it did at least advance. Having passed through the squadron in the greatest disorder, and without the least appearance of being under command, instead of pursuing the flying Turks, the flotilla swarmed around the Turkish ships, which were aground like a hive of bees. The Rear Admiral commanded Brigadier Alexiano to get together some vessels of our flotilla to dislodge the Turkish flotilla. At the same moment, the Rear Admiral advanced in his boat towards the left wing, where the Prince of Nassau was with his body of reserve, employed to very little purpose in surrounding the first Turkish vessel, which was aground, leaning on one side and firing upon it. The Rear Admiral entreated him to bring and send the reserve to act against the Turkish flotilla upon our right flank, and informed him of the misfortune which had befallen the little Alexander. But Monsieur de Nassau remained quietly behind his batteries and made no movement to dislodge the flotilla of the enemy. The Rear Admiral then met Brigadier Korsakov, to whom he gave orders similar to those he had given to Monsieur Alexiano. And these two officers, having got together as many vessels of the flotilla as they could collect, assisted our frigates in dislodging and chasing the Turkish flotilla even till under the walls of Achakov. Monsieur de Korsakov was a brave and intelligent man. He did not affect to have done anything wonderful. Alexiano was a man of limited talent and of questionable courage, but his vanity was excessive. He pretended to have towed a battery to within pistol shot of the enemy's flotilla, but Monsieur Akhmatov, who commanded that battery, declared that neither he nor any one of our people ever were near the Turkish flotilla than a half-cannon shot. The Turkish fleet was now distant. The Prince of Nassau was told that the Admiral's flag, which had been displayed on the vessel of the Captain Pasha, was struck, and he hastily advanced to claim it. The ship of the Captain Pasha, like the other, was a la bande, that is to say, it leaned more to one side and consequently could not make use of its guns. As the flag of the Captain Pasha fell into the water from the top of the main mast, having been struck down by a ball, it is not difficult to discover that the vessel which had fired this ball was in no danger of being touched by a case shot. The Zaporavians picked up the flag from the water, and the Prince of Nassau, a long while afterwards, had the glory, which he turned to good account, of having snatched it from their hands. The Rear Admiral might have claimed at least half of this flag, as he had his hands on it at the same moment with the Prince of Nassau, but he regarded it as a thing of very little consequence. Brandkugels had been thrown into the two Turkish vessels, which were aground, and they were burned. Was this a good or a bad piece of service? These two vessels were ours, from the circumstance of having run aground and because their crews had been left by their countrymen under the guns of our squadron. Wherefore did the flotilla interfere with them? Ought it not rather to have pursued the flying Turks, who were not yet under the protection of the guns of Achakov? Our flotilla had received no injury and had nothing to fear from the shallowness of the water. Having first sounded, the Rear Admiral made the squadron advance another verst and took post in a right line, barely out of shot of Achakov and in line with the last Turkish ship that had been run aground and taken. Fire soon after broke out in this prize, which had been imprudently fired upon with Brandkugels. The fleet and flotilla of the Turks now drew up in a line parallel to ours and under the walls of Achakov. How imbecile should the human mind become under the influence of sudden panic! The Rear Admiral, an hour after affair, advanced in his boat and took soundings all along the Turkish line, opposite the walls of Achakov, and within reach of case shot, and not a single gun was fired upon him. Previously to taking command of the squadron, the Rear Admiral had gone to Kinburn with the Chevalier Ribes Brigadier du Jour to the Prince Marshal to reconnoitre the position and force of the fleet and flotilla under the Captain Pasha, and to examine the entrance of the Liman. They arrived at Kinburn at the very time that the Captain Pasha had detached 21 vessels of war from his fleet and with that force entered the road of Achakov, the wind not permitting him to enter the Liman, where his flotilla and some transport ships were already stationed. The Rear Admiral was so struck at finding the tongue of land at Kinburn without any battery or block fort that he instantly spoke of it to the Commandant General Suvorov. This tongue of land from its position commands the only passage by which large vessels can either enter or come out of the Liman, and fortress of Kinburn is far too distant to be able to command this passage. The Rear Admiral proposed to establish one or more strong batteries upon this stripe of land, and Monsieur de Ribes seconded this proposition. After considerable delay, General Suvorov resolved to establish a block fort with heavy cannon upon this point and a battery farther within. But the Captain Pasha had already got the 21 ships in question into the Liman. At 10 o'clock on the night between the 17th and 18th of June, the Captain Pasha attempted to carry the remains of his squadron, which had been defeated at If, out of the Liman. But the block fort and battery fired on his ships of which 9 of the largest were forced aground upon the sand bank which runs out from Achakov, at the distance of cannon shot from the block fort. The block fort and battery fired on the enemy the whole night, and at daybreak General Suvorov sent to us requesting that we would send vessels to take possession of the ships of the enemy which had got aground. The Rear Admiral wished to send frigates, but Brigadier Alexianu assured him that he would run great risk of losing them. The current there, he said, was like that of a mill dam, and the bottom was so bad that anchors would not hold. It was accordingly resolved to proceed with the flotilla, and Alexiana, who had his private reasons, set out with the Prince of Nassau. The flotilla went pell-mell and without any sort of order or plan upon the 9 ships aground, fired Brankugels into them without mercy. It was in vain the wretched Turks made the signs of the cross and begged for quarter on their knees. Above 3,000 of them were burned with their ships. By some chance, 2 of these vessels, the least and the largest, did not take fire. The one was a corvette, very indifferently armed, carrying 1 battery and 4 pieces between decks. The other was a small brigantine of French construction, armed with 14 small guns. Neither the Prince of Nassau nor Alexiana was to be seen at this time. They were together and at some distance during this frightful carnage, and it was afterwards asked of them if they had not, during this time, been at Kinburn, as the greatest confusion reigned among the vessels of the flotilla. Though our loss was not great, there is no doubt that part of it was owing to Russian bullets. The army of Prince Potemkin having come up on the 27th of June, the Prince of Nassau had orders to attack and destroy or capture the Turkish flotilla which lay under the walls of Achakov, and the Rear Admiral was commanded to give him every assistance that might be useful. In pursuance of these orders, on the 1st of July, at 1 in the morning the flotilla advanced. The Rear Admiral has sent all the shaloops and barcasses belonging to the squadron to haul out the vessels of the flotilla. The Prince Marshal had taken the trouble to arrange the plan of attack himself, but his plan was not followed. At daybreak, our flotilla, having advanced only within cannon shot, opened fire upon the Turkish flotilla and on the place. The current, having carried several of our batteries and double shaloops rather too far to leeward, the Rear Admiral had them hauled up by the boats and barcasses of the squadron, and set the example himself with the shaloop in which he was. The Turks set fire themselves to a little frigate which they had prepared as a fireship and placed at anchor to the northeast of Fort Hassan Pasha. At 6 in the morning the Rear Admiral advanced considerably in front of the flotilla to seize 5 of the enemy galleys which lay within case shot to the east of Fort Hassan. The position of these galleys between the crossfire of our flotilla on one side and that of Fort Hassan, the Turkish flotilla, and the citadel of Achakov on the other rendered this a very dangerous enterprise. The Rear Admiral boarded the galley which lay farthest out and had it towed out of danger in a short time by Lieutenant Lev Fabrician. He afterwards boarded the galley of the Captain Pasha which lay considerably near the fort. From unskillfulness and excess of zeal, a young officer cut the cable of the galley without waiting the orders of the Rear Admiral, and before the boats could be got in order to hold it out, the wind drifted the galley toward the shore and still near to the fort. The Rear Admiral had the galley lightened by throwing many things overboard. After much search for ropes that might stretch to the wreck of the burnt frigate and get the galley afloat by the means, the plan failed from the ropes not being long enough. The Rear Admiral was very unwilling to yield to the obstinate position of the Turks, who fired upon him from all their bastions and from their flotilla, and he dispatched Lieutenant Fox to the Vladimir to fetch an anchor and cable. This was a certain means of securing his object in spite of the enemy, and in waiting the return of the lieutenant, he left the galley with his people and assisted again in towing the batteries. Before the return of Lieutenant Fox, he had, however, the mortification to see fire break out in the galley of the Captain Pasha. He at first believed that the slaves chained on board had found means to escape and had set fire to the vessel, but he had afterwards positive proof that Brigadier Alexiano, being in a boat at the time with the Prince of Nassau, on the outside of flotilla and being aware of the intention of the Rear Admiral, swore that it should not succeed, and sent a Greek canoe to set fire to the galley. The 3 other Turkish galleys were at once run down and burned by Brankugels. There were also a 2-masted ship and a large bomb vessel burnt near Fort Hassan Pasha. This includes all that was taken or destroyed by water, save 52 prisoners taken by the Rear Admiral in the 2 galleys. The wretched beings who were chained in the galley of the Captain Pasha perished there in the flames. The Prince Marshal having made an important diversion on the land side, it is to be regretted that advantage was not taken of this movement to seize the remainder of the enemy's flotilla. But our flotilla never came up within reach of grape shot. The above extract from the Rear Admiral's journal is verified in the following manner. This extract has been translated by me into the Russian language and read before the commanders of the ship Vladimir, captain of the 2nd rank Zefaliana, of the frigate Skory, captain of the 2nd rank Abalyanin, of the frigate Nikolai, Captain Lieutenant Danilov, of the frigate Tagirok, Lieutenant McKinnon, of the frigate the Little Alexander, Lieutenant Savitsky, and they have found nothing in them contrary to truth. On board the Vladimir, before Achakov, the 28th of October, 1788. Paul Dimitrevsky, Honorary Counselor of the College for Foreign Affairs, and by special orders of Her Imperial Majesty of all the Russias, Secretary to Rear Admiral and Chevalier Paul Jones. Addition of the Rear Admiral to the preceding journal. The moment the ships began to withdraw from Achakov, the Prince of Nassau and Brigadier Alexiano hurried straight to the headquarters of the Prince Marshal to relay the things which both pretended they had performed. In a few minutes after the flotilla began to retire, the rain fell in torrents, of which Nassau and Alexiano received their own share before reaching headquarters. 2 days afterwards, Brigadier Alexiano returned on board the Vladimir, having caught a malignant fever, of which he died on the 8th of July. The Prince of Nassau, who had made use of him in caballing against me, God knows wherefore, neither visited him in his sickness nor assisted at his funeral. At first, it was given out that the service must sustain the loss of every Greek in it, on account of his death. But I soon experienced the reverse. Not one asked to be dismissed. They remained under my command with the Russians and were more contented than before. On the day preceding the death of Alexiana, he had received intelligence of having been promoted 2 grades, and that Her Majesty had bestowed on him a fine estate and peasants in White Russia. At the same time, the Prince of Nassau had received a very valuable estate, with 3,000 or 4,000 peasants also in White Russia, and the military order of St. George, of the 2nd class. Her Majesty likewise gave him liberty to hoist the flag of Vice Admiral at the taking of Achakov, to which event it was apparently believed he would greatly contribute. I received the Order of St. Anne, an honor with which I am highly flattered, and with which I could have been perfectly satisfied, had others been recompensed only in the same proportion and according to the merit of their services. All the officers of the flotilla received a step of promotion and the gratuity of a year's pay. The greater part of them also obtained the Order of St. George of the last class. Only 2 of these officers had been bred to the sea. None of the others had been engaged in navigation. The officers of the squadron under my command were almost wholly marine officers. They had done their duty well when opposed to the enemy, but they obtained no promotion, no mark of distinction, no pecuniary gratification. My mortification was excessive, but my officers at this time gave me a very gratifying proof of their attachment. On promising that I would demand justice for them from the Prince Marshal at the close of the campaign, they stifled their vexation and made no complaint. I ought to have been mentioned in the proper place that 3 days after our success in the Liman, Prince Potemkin arrived at Kinburn, from whence he came on board the Vladimir to make me a visit. He was accompanied by General Count de Brandisky of Poland, the Prince de Ripnin, the Prince de Ligny, General de Samoilov, and several other officers. His Highness did me the honor to remain to dinner, and as he knew that an altercation has taken place between the Prince of Nassau and myself on the morning of the 18th of June, he had the goodness to employ the Prince de Ligny and Monsieur Littlepage, Chamberlain to the King of Poland, to persuade the Prince of Nassau to make me an apology. I accepted it with sincere pleasure. We embraced in presence of this honorable company, and I believed him as sincere as myself. The Prince Marshal charged me at this time to make arrangements for raising the cannon, anchors, and other effects belonging to the enemy's ships which had been burned. Without loss of time, I detailed a transport ship with officers and people for this service. His Highness the Prince Marshal advanced his army, which crossed the Bug and appeared in sight of us on the borders of the Liman on the 27th of June, and on the next day the Captain Pasha weighed anchor with his grand fleet, which had constantly remained 20 or 30 versts beyond Kinburn, and directed his course towards the entrance of the Danube, carrying 3 admirals' flags, and followed by all the vessels that had escaped us in the Liman. During the whole time that we were exposed to having a serious affair with the Turks, Brigadier Alexianu had carefully kept a Greek felucca of 18 oars alongside the Vladimir. This felucca was better built for sailing than any of the other chaloops or rowing vessels belonging to the whole squadron, so that he had at all times the means of saving himself in case of any disastrous event. Even the Prince of Nassau, since his retreat on the 6th of June, was never seen in any vessel of the flotilla, but always in a chaloupe, which had been built for the especial use of Her Imperial Majesty on her late voyage. For myself, I took no such precautions. I saw that I must conquer or die. For me, there was no retreat. The instant that Alexander saw the troops appear, he dispatched his felucca to inform the Prince Marshal that it was he, in his zeal for the service, who had employed people to save the effects of the burned prizes. Nothing could be less true. He had not taken the smallest concern in the matter. But this shows the character of the man. Next day I was informed that the transport ship I had employed on this service was already too heavily laden and made a great deal of water. As the wind was fair for Gluboka, I gave orders that she should immediately go thither to unload. Some hours after the departure of the transport, Brigadier Alexiano returned from Kinburn, where he had dined, and said several impertinent things to me on the subject of the transport. He went afterwards to headquarters to complain of me to the Prince Marshal. In consequence of this complaint, I received a letter from his Brigadier du jour, the Chevalier Ribas, which among other things mentioned that the Prince Marshal was singularly severe and strict in all that related to the orders he gave. I replied that I was not afraid of the severity of the Prince Marshal, and I had done nothing save my duty in pursuance of his own orders. Next day I paid a visit to Prince de Nassau. I supposed I should be received with open arms. A reconciliation, it will be remembered, had lately taken place, as stated in the beginning of this part of the journal. But he blew out me faisant scène about the transport, belonging, as he said, to his flotilla. I had told him I had been charged with that necessary business by the Prince Marshal, and that as all the vessels of war and transports belonged to Her Imperial Majesty, and the transport in question was empty when I ordered it to be taken, I could not see that he had the least ground of complaint. He was mad with rage, but as the good of the service did not further require our combined operations, I thought his quarreling was too puerile to concern myself about it. I took leave of him, begging him to reflect that I had given him no cause for displeasure. I did not wish to come to a rupture with him. But on the 1st of July, seeing the day dawn, and that the flotilla was still far too distant to make the necessary attack, in meeting him in his chaloupe, I asked if he did not think it time to begin the attack. "Is it of me you thus inquire?" he replied. "I have nothing to say to you on the subject." After a reply so uncivil and so publicly made, it was impossible I could have any further intercourse with him. On the 18th of June, in giving an account to the Prince Marshal of the fate of the 9 vessels run aground and coming out of the Liman upon the shallows opposite the battery and block fort on the tongue of land of Kinburn, I took the liberty to propose to him to get the Vladimir, which had portholes for 70 pieces of cannon, and the large frigate Alexander, which might have carried 50 pieces, completely armed, that at the first opportunity the squadron of Kherson might join that of Sebastopol. But His Highness gave no orders for this purpose till the month of September, and the Admiralty was so slow in acting that the vessels were not equipped by the 18th of October, when I was recalled to St. Petersburg by an order from Her Imperial Majesty. The fleet of the Captain Pasha, having sailed on the 28th of June, had a rencounter with that of Sebastopol, which had come out some days before. But the Turkish fleet being much stronger than that of Russia, the latter fled, and had the good fortune to get back to Sebastopol without loss, having no more than 6 or 7 men killed and wounded, which shows that the affair was neither close nor warm. After the affair of the 18th of June, the greater part of our flotilla remained several days at anchor between Kinburn and the block fort on the end of the tongue of land. On the 20th, the wind being strong and from the west, a Turkish brigantine equipped with a fire ship put off towards Kinburn. The enemy set fire to her as they abandoned her, and she was consumed. It is surprising that the Russian seamen and pilots could be so profoundly ignorant respecting the anchorage, currents, and depths of the Liman, and above all, at the entrance into the canal, Fanshaw, and in the road between Achakov and Berezань. At first, not a single commander in the flotilla durst venture to cast an anchor. Being at Kinburn on the 28th of June, General Suvorov spoke to me of the unpleasant circumstance of not being able to cut off the communication between Achakov and Berezань. Having sounded myself, I informed him that this was quite as practicable as it was necessary, and I would place the frigates there instantly if he would only require me to do so. He did not hesitate, and the same day I placed 3 frigates there. Monsieur Alexiana did all he could to prevent this, and when he saw the frigates set off, prophesied that I need not expect to see them return. He carried his intrigue so far that the Prince Marshal wrote me a warning letter on the 29th, and on the 1st of July a peremptory order to withdraw them. During the short time they were there, they took 2 Turkish armed chaloops and a bateau laden with powder and shot, and cut off the enemy's communication between Achakov and Berezань. The Prince Marshal had not been satisfied with the conduct of the flotilla in the affair of attacking Achakov on the 1st of July, which was conducted in a very irregular manner and at too great a distance. The most advanced charge was that of the battery commanded by Monsieur Akhmatov, who was never less than 500 toises distant from the enemy. On the 10th of July, the Prince Marshal sent the Prince of Nassau to Sebastopol to learn if the squadron had been much damaged in the rencounter with the Turkish fleet. Immediately after the departure of the Prince of Nassau, the Prince Marshal gave the Chevalier Ribas the command of the flotilla with orders to go to Kinburn to receive on board the troops he destined to make a descent on the island of Berezань. At the same time, he ordered me to establish a line of blockade between that island and Achakov. I stationed 5 frigates carrying 12-pounders in the road for that purpose. On the 14th, I was ordered to inspect the entrance of the Liman. I immediately went to Kinburn to have an understanding with General Suvorov and Brigadier de Ribas. Though the brigadier had been incessantly occupied since the departure of the Prince de Nassau in bringing the crews of the flotilla to some sort of order, he had not yet completed this task. So great was the confusion that reigned, that he could not find in any vessel 5 soldiers belonging to the same company, and the officers knew not where to look for their men. This retarded the embarkation of the troops destined for the descent till the 16th. The Prince Marshal was so much displeased with this delay that on the 17th he gave orders to land the troops that they might join the army before Achakov, and that the flotilla should return into the Liman, as well as the 5 frigates I had posted for the blockade. From the commencement of the projected expedition against Berezань, Monsieur Ribas had requested me to conduct the flotilla and descent of the troops. Though a man of much talent, he had not the misplaced conceit of some persons who readily take upon them things far beyond their capacity. I told him he well knew I ought to have commanded the flotilla, as well as the squadron, from the beginning of the campaign, but that my gratitude for the gracious reception accorded me by Her Imperial Majesty, together with the very delicate state in which I have found affairs, had induced me to sacrifice my feelings and even greatly to hazard my reputation for the good of the empire, that I could never so far humble myself as to request the direction of the flotilla. But if the Prince Marshal thought proper to propose it to me, I would do my best to make the most of it possible. On the afternoon of the 17th, the Prince Marshal fairly proposed to give me the command of the flotilla. His Highness informed me his intention was to give Achakov attack a second time. I replied that I was disposed to execute with zeal whatever he might think proper for the good of the service, but that to attack with advantage it was necessary to come to close quarters, and to advance in better order than on the 1st of July. He was of the same opinion and requested me to come ashore next day, that we might concert together the plan of attack. I did not fail to comply with the orders of the Prince Marshal, but His Highness spoke no more of the flotilla. I remained to dinner and supper, and afterwards returned on board of my ship. The Prince of Nassau, having returned some days before from Sebastopol, had intrigued with the Prince de Ligne, and the Prince Marshal had restored him to the command of the flotilla. On the 18th of June I had been ordered to dispatch the 5 frigates which had returned into the Liman to be refitted at Gluboka en batterie for sea service. I sent them off at daybreak on the 19th, having taken the greater part of their crews for service in the gunboats and bomb vessels which the Prince Marshal proposed to place under my command. On the 20th, I received 21 gunboats, each carrying a single piece, from 18 to 32 pounders, and 5 bomb vessels, each carrying a mortar, of which 4 were of 3 puds and 1 of 5 puds. The same day, the Prince Marshal, having established his headquarters to the right of his army upon the shores of the Black Sea, he had hitherto been on the shores of the Liman on the left wing, pointed out to me 2 of the enemy's gunboats stationed close by the fort of Hasan Pasha and the Turkish lines on the side of Birizan. He was persuaded that there would be attempt to come out during the night with dispatches and inquired of me if it were not possible to capture them. As His Highness appeared to attach great importance to this service, I undertook it. I returned on board the Vladimir, from whence at 8 in the evening I set off with 5 armed shaloops. I made 5 gunboats follow, as a measure of precaution in case the Turks had attempted to make a sortie, as their shaloops sailed much faster than ours. I found one of the Turkish gunboats aground, hauled up, and almost dry on the sands adjoining the battery. And on the entrenchment the enemy had cast up on the water's edge. It was impossible to get it afloat under the terrible fire which we sustained from all the lines and batteries on the shore. The other gunboat lay just afloat, right against the fort of Hasan Pasha to the south. Lieutenant Edwards boarded this vessel and cut her cables. But having had several of his men wounded and being deserted by one of the shaloops, he was obliged to give up the attempt, lest he should be left by the other shaloop also. During this time I had made some efforts to get the other Turkish boat afloat. I now rowed quickly to the assistance of Mr. Edwards, but the night was dark and he was already out of sight when I boarded the vessel in which he had been. I had several men wounded around me, but in defiance of the enemy I hauled the vessel out and stationed it right opposite the headquarters of the Prince Marshal. On the 21st, at daybreak, I sailed with the Vladimir, followed by all the vessels of the squadron and yet remained with me, and 24 gunboats and bomb vessels that I had been placed under my command. The object of this movement was again to blockade Ochakov by sea and to cut off the communication between that place and Birizan. To accomplish this object, I stationed the Vladimir and the Alexander to blockade the channel at the entrance of the Liman, and I continued the same line of blockade into the road by placing the smaller vessels there. As the bomb vessels and gunboats had not water casks, the Prince Marshal, who wished to see this craft opposite his headquarters, made wells be dug on shore for the accommodation of the crews, and on the 24th ordered my officer du jour to have the vessels stationed near the shore. I knew nothing of this change, for I had placed them the previous night in line and far enough off to be in safety. On the 25th the wind was from the south, but blew moderately. After dinner I went to headquarters to make a visit to the Prince Marshal, and found to my great astonishment that half the boats were cast ashore, and the other half in the greatest danger. I set to work instantly with my chaloupe to haul off, to bring to anchor all the vessels possible, and by means of anchors and cables for which I sent to the squadron, we saved them all except 6 gunboats, which went to pieces and filled with sand. On the 26th the Prince Marshal wrote me by his brigadier du jour to inform me that I was at liberty to place the boats I had saved where I pleased. I placed them near the tongue of land of Kingbourne, where they had a sheltered haven, and also wells for the accommodation of the men. They sustained no further injury during the time they remained under my command. At this time 2 shaloops or small cutters were placed under my orders, of which each carried 2 Licorns of 48 pounds caliber in the forepart and 6 falconets on the side. Shortly afterwards I got 2 larger cutters, carrying each 2 mortars of 5 puds. On the 31st of July, the Captain Pasha again made his appearance with his fleet, followed by several vessels which he had not when he went off. His advanced guard, composed of his frigates, bomb vessels and small craft, cast anchor near Birizan, while his large squadron of ships of the line resumed their old position. The Prince Marshal ordered me to bring back my small vessels to assist in blocking up the passage at the entrance of the Liman, and the Prince of Nassau was ordered to block up the road with his flotilla, and thus cut off the communication of the Turkish small vessels by the shallows to the south of Fort Hasan Pasha. The Prince of Nassau hoisted a white flag with a blue cross on one of the galleys on leaving the Liman, and that galley having passed under the stern of the Vladimir on the 1st of August, he pretended that I ought to salute him as Vice Admiral. First, When I hoisted my flag to avoid the idle vanity of exacting a salute, I did it at night, and the Prince de Nassau, being only a simple volunteer, did not offer to salute it. Second, an officer without my orders coming from Kherson had saluted the prince without my authority, but they did not give him a single gun in return. Third, the prince had not received the grade of Vice Admiral in the service of His Imperial Majesty. Fourth, I had no orders from the Prince Marshal to salute the Prince de Nassau. Fifth, the latter had applied in the last war between France and England to serve with me, and assuredly not as my commander, for I thought he has made a voyage around the world, he does not yet understand the compass. Sixth, on saluting an officer of a superior grade, it is necessary to go on board his flagship to make a report and receive orders. And I had in no wise deserved so grave a punishment as to be put under the orders of the Prince de Nassau. Had the Prince Marshal been dissatisfied with my conduct on this occasion, he would have mentioned it to me or issued an order. The Prince of Nassau, however, had endeavored to make it appear, at court especially, that his difference with me had no other foundation than in my not choosing to salute his flag. He lowered it 2 or 3 days afterwards. How should he have done so if he had been Vice Admiral? The Captain Pasha came out from day to day to sound and reconnoiter in his Kir language, which sailed like the wind and always displayed an admiral's flag. As the block fort and battery on the tongue of land at Kinburn were only constructed of bags of sand and were neither protected by a ditch or palisade, I was afraid that the Captain Pasha might try to carry them by a sudden descent, which he could have done by landing 500 men. General Suvorov had been dangerously wounded in a sortie made by the garrison of Achakov and had come to Kinburn. I convinced him that the block fort and battery seemed to be menaced, and as he had a greater quantity of chevaux de frise at Kinburn that he required, I suggested that he should employ what was superfluous in surrounding the block fort and battery. The general gave orders accordingly, and I ranged all my gunboats and bomb vessels hard by the strip of land between the block fort and the battery. The sand served them as a parapet, so that there was a line of fire continued from the point quite to the battery. The small craft were, besides, always ready to change their position at the first movement of the enemy. And I placed the squadron so advantageously to communicate with the block fort and the battery without confining their fire, and to keep back the enemy for a crossfire on entering the channel of the Liman. Though we were very weak compared to the Turkish fleet, the Captain Pasha never either attempted to make a descent or to force the passage of the entrance of the Liman. The Prince Marshal having ordered Rear Admiral Vainovich to sail from Sebastopol with the fleet under his command, and that officer having raised obstacles because his force was not, he conceived, powerful enough to attack that under the command of the Captain Pasha, His Highness sent me a letter written by his Chief Secretary, Brigadier Popov, on the 19th of August, old style, proposing that I should go to Sebastopol to take command of the fleet. It may be remembered that I was brought to Russia to command all the naval force in the Black Sea, consequently this proposition did not surprise me. Had the Prince Marshal ordered me to go, I would have proceeded immediately, but I would not have it appear that I sought to be sent. First, my naval signals had not been yet translated into the Russian language, and no attention had been given to my request for a person capable of translating them. Secondly, the naval signals used in that fleet were imperfect and very limited. Thirdly, I was acquainted with no one in the fleet, and I was aware that Prince Marshal wished that it should come out of the very day after my arrival at Sebastopol. Fourthly, that fleet had been compelled to fly before that of the Captain Pasha, at a time when he had 2,000 fewer good seamen. Fifthly, the fleet at Sebastopol was as weak as before, but that of the Captain Pasha was stronger in craft, and had all the men replaced that had been lost in the affair of the Liman. Sixthly, I had just received preparatory orders from the Prince Marshal to attack Fort Hassan Pasha, and I hoped to show him the difference between my fashion of attack and that of the 1st of July. I reply in answer to his letter that being entirely devoted to the good of the state, His Highness would find me eager to fulfill his orders. It was said that some days afterwards the Prince Marshal sent positive orders to Admiral Vainovich to come out, but that he always found reasons for not dealing further with the Captain Pasha. On the 30th of August, the Turks took a small lotka freighted with watermelons belonging to the merchants of Kinburn. In coming down the Liman, the people on board had been foolish enough to pass too close to Achakov. To punish the Turks for this, the Prince of Nassau at evening made his flotilla advance to assault Achakov. I sent my secretary to headquarters and in the meanwhile assembled the commanders of divisions of my gunboats and bomb vessels and ordered them to bring forward their divisions to form in line of battle between the squadron and Achakov, ready to attack the fort of Hassan Pasha the moment orders should arrive. Upon the return of Captain Pasha, Monsieur Littlepage, Chamberlain to the King of Poland, being then with the Prince Marshal, had solicited and obtained leave to command the division of my gunboats. Night being come on, the chiefs of divisions, wishing to bring forward their boats, found that 13 of them had already quitted their posts, against the most positive orders to make no movement without their commanders of division. This movement had been occasioned by a rashness of a Greek lieutenant belonging to the division of Monsieur Littlepage. The boat of this lieutenant had been fired 8 shots against the place and another 6, but none of the rest had fired. As this lieutenant was the most to blame, I deprived him of his command and sent him to headquarters, which was required by the Prince Marshal. The Prince of Nassau, who had very idly wasted a great deal of ammunition, pretended that my boats had prevented him from taking the whole Turkish flotilla. The Greek lieutenant, whom I had disgraced, instead of being punished, was promoted to the command of a double chaloupe, mounting to obusier that would throw 96 pounds weight of balls. Monsieur Littlepage gave a particular account of the whole affair in a letter to the Grand General of Poland. A few days after this, the Prince Marshal sent Rear Admiral Mordvinov on board the Vladimir to assemble all the captains and master pilots of the squadron to hold a council on the means of effecting a junction between the squadron of Kherson and the fleet of Sebastopol. It was said that the Prince Marshal had earnestly entreated this officer to take the affair upon himself and that he had positively declined it. I can say nothing on his head. I only know that it was a delicate step in relation to me to send another officer on board my ship to hold a council, and above all without having apprised me either by speech or writing. If I had been stickling, I would have put this officer under arrest, as he could show no authority nor precedent for holding a council where I commanded. But as I was influenced by the good of this service, above every personal consideration, I received Admiral Mordvinov most amicably, and after dinner assembled the officers in question after consultation. My difficulties presented themselves to their minds against the proposed junction, but as it was known that the Prince Marshal was determined on the measure, it was agreed that it could not be effected but at Haji Bay, upon the coast, between Berezan and the Danube, at the distance of 50 versts from the point of Kinburn. I raised no obstacle. I only observed that since it was pressingly necessary to beat the advanced guard of the enemy before we could effect the proposed junction, it was indispensable to station the squadron previously in the road of Achakov and to sail from thence with the wind from north to north-northwest to avoid being attacked on the way by the grand fleet of the Turks, and to keep it to the leeward till the junction was effected. It was only a few days previously that preparations had been begun to complete the armament of the Vladimir and Alexander. During this time Her Imperial Majesty had sent 24 swords of massive gold to headquarters to be distributed among the officers on account of the Battle of the Liman. The Prince Marshal himself received a gold sword enriched with diamonds and emeralds, and the Prince of Nassau received one ornamented with a row of diamonds. There were a number of silver medals sent at the same time to be distributed among the soldiers and seamen. The swords had not yet been distributed, but the medals were all given to the men of the flotilla, and not a solitary one to the squadron. It is usual to give subalterns the more merit, the more they are exposed to personal danger. The crews of the squadron had often towed the flotilla total uncovered and exposed to the fire of the enemy, whilst the people of the flotilla were screened by parapets made of bags of wool by which the vessels were surrounded. On the 18th of September, I received a secret order from the Prince Marshal to attack the advanced guard of the enemy anchored under Berezan. His Highness proposed to make the attack with the 5 frigates which had been sent to Gluboka to be mounted as batteries. And these frigates were to be supported by the other vessels of the squadron excepting the Vladimir and the Alexander, the arming of which went on very slowly on account of difficulties on the part of the Admiralty. 2 of the frigates, the Skori and the Beristan, had already rejoined the squadron. Before the equipments of those frigates were altered, they carried more guns than are ever put either by the French or English into ships of the same kind. The Scory, for example, carried 40 guns, and in England they would not have put more than 32 into her. She now carried 16 36-pounders and 4 Licorns 18-pounders. They called her a sea battery. The amount of her caliber now compared with what it was before had the advantage of 648 pounds over 452. But to gain this they had been obliged to open her portholes en échiquier, because there was not room enough for recoil to place the guns on each side opposite. And for the same reason they were obliged after all to shift the guns from their places and make a sort of platform for the purpose on the side of the ship, and so with the others. When it was resolved to mount 36s on the 5 frigates, it must be supposed that the fact had not been adverted to that they had no bullets of that size, and that they would be obliged to use 24-pound shot. To remedy this, recourse was had to means entirely novel. The 24-pound bullets were dipped in pitch to make them fill up the bore of the 36s. The use of these pitched bullets seems dangerous for those who work the guns, for if the smallest particle of the combustible material remains in the piece, it must set fire to the next cartridge, and a single such accident would damp the courage of the most resolute men. But putting aside all this and many other inconveniences, the only advantage gained by using the 24-pound bullets for the 36-pound guns on board the Scory would be reduced to the difference between 456, the actual caliber, and 452, the former. By experience, it has been ascertained in the French Marine that 2 shots can be fired from an 18-pounder for 1 from a 36, if both pieces are worked with equal convenience. By this account, it may be judged whether the change in the armament of these frigates was a good or bad operation. Presuming to decide the question, I will only say that in my opinion, 18-pounders are the largest and best for frigates. I think that guns of a larger caliber are worked too slowly for vessels which have but 1 battery and cannot keep up with rolling fire so necessary in attacking Turks. The 5 frigates, of which I have perhaps spoken too much, appeared to me very fit to place behind a stockado or bar, but I never would make choice of ships of this kind for the sea service. The first broadside is all that is to be feared from them. I replied in writing to the proposition of the Prince Marshal for attacking the advanced guard of the Turks near Berezan, and afterwards had a plan of attack drawn out for his inspection. He was much pleased with it. As it was necessary to take advantage of a northerly wind to effect the enterprise, I proposed to the Prince Marshal to place the frigates in the road as soon as they arrived from Gluboka, to preserve, while waiting the attack of the line, a permanent blockade between Achakov and the enemy outside. His Highness said it was not yet time for this, and ordered me to place them in a line with the other vessels of my squadron, so as to make a display in the channel of the Liman. In the end of the month, the Turkish fleet set sail in the night, followed by all the vessels that had lain under Berezan, and we saw it at a great distance the next morning. The Captain Pasha returned in about 36 hours and resumed the position he had left. The only difference was that he brought in some additional small vessels, and that he considerably reinforced his advanced guard under Berezan. As our flotilla, which ought to have blockaded the road and cut off the communication with the small vessels on that side, we only there occasionally, as if by caprice. It was quite natural for the Turks to profit by its absence and go out and in when they found the way clear. The flotilla being to leeward between my squadron and Kinburn on the 8th of October. The Captain Pasha sent off in the evening 3 vessels of his advanced guard, which entered Achakov unmolested by an open passage. Our flotilla made no movement. I made an attempt to intercept the enemy's progress with my gunboats, which I caused to be hauled to windward by the ship's boats of the squadron. But the wind being high, they could not bring them to attack. Our batteries nearest to Achakov fired on the 3 Turkish vessels, but without being able to arrest their progress. It was now dark, and moreover the distance between these batteries and the block fort on the side of Kinburn being 7 versts, the land batteries never could have prevented either the entrance or exit of small vessels. To command the entrance of the Liman, I think it is requisite to establish a fort with 2 batteries, one over the other on the shallows, which run out a considerable distance from the point of sand of Kinburn toward Berezan, and which would command even the entrance of the road of Achakov. One of the Turkish ships had defaulted to cast anchor in the shallows of Fort Hassan Pasha, and at daybreak on the 9th, being without shot of our most advanced land battery, was struck between wind and water and sunk. The other two vessels got in without difficulty. I have already mentioned that on the 18th of August, I received a preparatory order for attacking the fortress of Hassan Pasha with my bomb vessels and the shaloops armed with lighthorns and mortars. I expected from day to day an order for action, and had in consequence bestowed much pain in training my men to the necessary evolutions. But the final orders never arrived. The Prince of Nassau having caballed against my plan of attack, it was set aside, and by a new arrangement, which I was commanded to form with General Müller, Commander-in-Chief of Artillery, I was destined to assault the entrenchment and the Turkish batteries on the shore of the road. On the 9th of October, the flotilla advanced from the shores of Kinburn and attacked the Chakov. But this attack was conducted and ended in the very same manner as that of the 13th of August, save that a small vessel of the Turkish flotilla was stranded, which lay further out than any of the others on the shallows this side of Fort Hassan Pasha. On the 10th of October, I received another preparatory order and soon afterwards was ordered to give up all the boats to the flotilla. Towards evening, I went to headquarters to take particular orders in relation to these boats. The Prince Marshal told me he had the strongest desire to pitch overboard a large piece of artillery placed on the forward part of the vessel of the Turkish flotilla that stood farthest out and which had run aground. I imagined at the time that there was no other vessel running aground save the one in the road, which was at the distance of a verst from the fortress of Hassan Pasha. So I said the thing was quite easy, for although the Turks should come up in force to defend the vessel, there would always be time to spike the piece of cannon. It was night when I undertook this little enterprise. I did not imagine the Prince Marshal attached so much importance to it, as to wish I should conduct it in person. I confined it to Lieutenant Edwards, a brave and intelligent man, whom I wished to reward for past services. First, on the 1st of July he had followed me throughout and was a long time with me in the galley of the Captain Pasha. Secondly, he had followed me on the night of the 20th of July and had boarded and cut the cable of the vessel which I took opposite the fortress of Hassan Pasha. Thirdly, he had assisted me some days afterwards when by orders of the Prince Marshal we made trial of bombarding the fort from one of the bomb vessels, from which service we had some difficulty in withdrawing, as the wind, which rising at the moment, kept us for a long while under the fire of the enemy's musketry, which wounded some of our men. Mr. Edwards returned before daybreak without having succeeded. He said there were a great many men in the ship who fired on him, and that he durst not board her, he was so ill supported. I was so vexed that he had failed, that in my report to the Prince Marshal I said that I would conduct the enterprise myself next night, if that would satisfy him. The Prince Marshal held me at my word, but it was 11 at night when Mr. Edwards returned with the order. The wind, which was high, was quite against me, as well as a strong tide, and I would have deferred the attempt if I had not conceived my honor pledged. I was led to hope that after midnight the wind might fall and the strength of the tide lessen if it did not change. The night was very dark and the rain fell in torrents. I waited till 2 o'clock when the moon rose. I had with me 5 armed canoes, and I calculated on being followed by 4 bateaux Zaporovians and by of the armed vessels I had taken from the Turks. But it was impossible to tow them against wind and tide, and I was compelled to go on as I best could with only my 5 canoes. I have noticed that our flotilla had run aground a small Turkish vessel in the shallows of the fortress of Hassan Pasha, but I did not perceive this till the 11th, after I had dispatched Mr. Edwards to headquarters, because the vessel lay so near the fortress, where the water is of little depth, that it only sunk a foot or 15 inches, and consequently appeared as if still afloat. As the Prince Marshal had only spoken to me of the farthest out of the Turkish flotilla, I began to think he meant to designate the one nearest the fortress, in which idea was confirmed by Mr. Edwards at his return from headquarters, telling me he had heard ashore that the vessel ran down in the road that had been visited, but that nothing had been found there. I rode for the vessel nearest the fortress, which carried, like most of the others alongside, a large cannon in her bow, but after having fatigued my rowers, I was vexed to see daylight appear, whilst I had still more than a verst to go before I could reach the vessel. I returned on board my own ship to prevent a useless alarm, being persuaded I could succeed next night. Without waiting to receive my report, the Prince Marshal sent me the orders to abandon the enterprise, for he had entrusted it to other ships. There was fine weather on the night between the 12th and 13th, but the other ships did nothing, and the Turks availed themselves of an open way to bring out all their flotilla, which rejoined the ships of the advanced guard under Berezan. Some days afterwards, a colonel of Cossacks boarded the vessel run down in the road and set fire to it, by leaving in it lighted brannkugels, for which he received public thanks. On the 13th, the Prince Marshal wished to establish a permanent line of blockade in the road by placing my frigates there and some other small vessels. He wrote me a letter on the subject on that day, which contained things that strongly affected me, and to which I replied next day with perhaps too much freedom and warmth. This occasioned an interchange of letters between His Highness and myself, which was only terminated on the 18th by the arrival of Admiral Mordvinov to take command of the squadron and the flotilla. For the Prince of Nassau had set off for Warsaw some days after his affair of the 9th, with which the Prince Marshal had been much dissatisfied. I at the same time received orders from Her Imperial Majesty to go to St. Petersburg to be employed in the North Sea. Sweden had declared war against Russia at the commencement of the campaign, and Admiral Greig, who commanded the Russian fleet, having died, I was assured Her Majesty had very important views in recalling me. Yet I could not but feel grieved to be deprived of my command when the campaign, so far as regarded maritime operations, was so nearly concluded. As soon as the Prince of Nassau went off, all the gold swords were distributed to the officers of the flotilla. It is easy to imagine that this arrangement, as well as many others which preceded it, was not calculated to give me pleasure. The capture of the Turkish galley and the boarding of the galley of Captain Pasha on the 1st of July were without dispute the most brilliant actions of the campaign of the Liman. The credit of them was most unjustly given to the flotilla, and my officers remained without any reward for the important services which they had rendered in these affairs, beside those of the 18th of June, the 30th of August, and the 9th of October, from which they reaped no advantage. After the gold swords had been distributed, I myself heard several of the officers who got them express their astonishment, not being able to guess for what they had been so highly rewarded. It is worthy of notice that all the large vessels which the flotilla attacked were previously aground. In this case, they might be compared to men with their feet nailed to planks and their hands tied behind their backs. This is the only instance in history of ships aground, and out of the possibility of being recaptured, being attacked and destroyed with their crews by combustibles such as the brannkugels. It may be recollected that during the whole campaign the flotilla had not taken even one small vessel afloat. Since a very mistaken notion has been formed of the vessels taken in the Liman on the 17th and the 18th of June, which have been called ships of the line, it is but right to say that I made Lieutenant Fox measure the hulls of the two largest, and we found that the size of the one was 130 and the other 135 feet English in total length, in the line of their first battery. Apply this to naval architecture. Yet the Prince of Nassau has been rewarded in a brilliant manner for having destroyed 6 and captured 2 ships of the line. The only 3-masted vessels which escaped burning upon the 18th of June, with a caravel of 1 battery and 4 pieces between decks. There escaped also 1 small brigantine of 14 3-pounders. Such were the 2 vessels of the line that were captured, and the latter was wrecked next day by the carelessness of those who had the charge of her. In place of 8 vessels of the line, the Captain Pasha had come into the Liman with only a detachment of caravels or large merchantmen, frigates, bomb ships, and other smaller craft. Only 4 of the caravels carried guns between decks. Of this number was the vessel saved. No one of these 4 vessels was displayed a square flag, but there was the same on the galley and the Kirlangich of the Captain Pasha. It has been already said that the Grand Fleet without Kinburn displayed 3 admirals' flags, but by the history of the campaign given by the Prince of Nassau it appears that the Captain Pasha had lost his best ship, manned with the picked men of his fleet, and his only flag as Grand Admiral, while it is well known that at the end of the campaign he went back to Constantinople with all the ships of the line he had at its commencement. As I was told that some ill-intentioned persons in the army had said that I had been deprived of my command, because the officers were unwilling to serve under me. I endeavored to procure testimonials to the contrary, and have seen with regret that the mind is not always free, and that men sometimes dare not render homage to truth. The last of the 5 frigates called at the time sea batteries did not rejoin the squadron until the 19th of October, and on the same day, Admiral Mordvinov placed the line of the blockading vessels in the road much further out than before, so as to mask the fire of all the guns ashore on both sides. It was ill-judged, because the land batteries ought always to be able to flank a line of blockade formed by the vessels of floating batteries. On the 20th, the wind being rather fresh from the north, the admiral made a signal at 3 p.m. for all the flotilla to leave the road, and come while it was in their favor to take station near Kinburn. This movement was entirely unnecessary for the safety of the flotilla, but the Captain Pasha availed himself of it and got in on the same night 24 vessels loaded with ammunition for the garrison and having on board, besides their crews, 2,700 men. The flotilla attacked these vessels on the succeeding days, but the Turks, having taken out their cargoes, hauled them up on the road under the cannon of their batteries where much harm could not be done to them. Having reflected that the season was too far advanced to render my services necessary in the North Sea before the following year, I wrote to the Prince Marshal offering to continue my services till the end of the campaign. I was indebted to him for the Order of St. Anne, and I have a heart naturally grateful. He directed his secretary, M. Popov, to write me that since I was recalled by the order of the Empress, it was necessary I should go. I was invited to headquarters to take leave and to receive a letter from the Prince Marshal for Her Imperial Majesty. As I was much interested personally, and still more so in relation to my officers, I after dinner spoke freely and told M. Popov all that was on my mind. This brigadier repeated what I had said to the Prince Marshal. He was vexed at first, but afterwards he sent for me to talk with him. Without failing in the respect due to him, I spoke to him freely enough. I told him he had played an unfair game at the opening of the campaign in dividing the command in the Liman in the existing circumstances of the country, and that if I had not resolved to sacrifice my own feelings in order to manage the persons he had given me for colleagues, the campaign would have taken a very different turn. He replied, "Agreed, but it is too late now." He then said he would be glad to see me fixed in Russia, and that he was disposed to give me solid proof of his esteem both now and in future. I showed him the testimonial of the captain of the Vladimir and some other papers to convince him that he had neither done justice to me nor to the squadron. He said the Prince of Nassau pretended all was done by himself. "But I have never," said he, "been deceived in him. I have always known him for what he is." He proposed that I should go to Taganrog to equip and command a squadron he was building there. But as I had been brought to Russia to take the chief command in the Black Sea, and had received orders from the Empress to repair to St. Petersburg, I declined the offer. I only entreated that he would consider the services of my officers and give them the seniority they had lost by the promotion of those officers of the flotilla who did not belong to the naval service. Admiral Mordvinov told the same request, and the prince promised to do them justice. 2 days afterwards I received a letter from the Prince Marshal for the Empress, in which he noticed the zeal and anxiety I had ever shown for her service, and to render myself worthy of your favor. On the 4th of November, the Captain Pasha, having withdrawn his advanced guard in the night, set sail in the morning with his whole force, entering first Varna and afterward Constantinople, with every ship of the line he had at the opening of the campaign. It is singular that this enterprising commander did not attempt to force the entrance of the Liman, for Admiral Mordvinov had placed the squadron in so exposed and disadvantageous a situation that the fire of the land batteries, which should have flanked him without, was entirely covered. But it is maybe presumed that the Turkish admiral believed he had done enough for the safety of Ochakov by the succors he had thrown into the place. On the morning of the 7th, agreeably to a secret order from the Prince Marshal, the Zaporovians landed to the number of 2,000 on the island of Berezan. The Turkish garrison, being only 300 strong, fired a few random shots and then surrendered at discretion. Having given the officers whom I had commanded such testimonials as they merited, I embarked on the morning of the 9th of November in a small open galley for Kherson. I was 3 days and 3 nights on the way and suffered a great deal from the excessive cold. The day after my arrival, the river was frozen up and I was taken dangerously ill. My health was not sufficiently re-established to enable me to proceed before the 6th of December. Having arrived at St. Elizabeth, I received intelligence that Achakov had been taken by storm on the 6th. The garrison was 11,000 strong, including the 3,000 that the Captain Pasha had thrown into the place before he sailed. But the cold had become extreme, and the Russian army being formed in 6 columns to attack the place at day dawn, the Turks were completely disconcerted. Judging from the past, they expected no such visit, and becoming panic-struck, suffered their throats to be cut like so many sheep. In the fury of the assault, the Russian soldiers spared nothing. I have been assured that from 18 to 19,000 Turks perished on that day. As I wished to delay my arrival at court till that of the Prince Marshal, I stopped some days at Shklov, where General Sorich loaded me with civilities. I arrived at St. Petersburg on the 28th of December and was ordered to appear at court on the 31st, when Her Imperial Majesty did me the honor of granting me a private audience. I presented the letter the Prince Marshal had given me. A few days afterwards, the Empress sent me word through Count Dmitrius Mamonov that she might wait the arrival of Prince Potemkin before deciding on what she would do for me. In the meanwhile, Count Bezborodko told me that a command of greater importance was intended for me than that of the Black Sea. On the 1st of February, the Prince Marshal, not having yet arrived, I gave in to the Vice-Chancellor, Count Dosterman, a project for forming an alliance, political and commercial, between Russia and the United States. As the object of this project was reciprocal advantages, and above all to encourage the commerce of the Black Sea and of the settlements of the Crimea, I had long intended to transmit it to the Prince Marshal, and on his arrival at court about the middle of February I sent him a copy. Some time afterwards he took me into his cabinet and said that my plan contained good ideas, but that he did not think it expedient to adopt it at this time, as it might still further irritate the English against Russia, and that it was necessary first to make peace with the Turks. I might make many remarks about the fleet and flotilla of Kherson, but shall say but little at present. I have already observed that the Turkish vessels, large and small, have a decided advantage over the Russians in their movement. The Marshal de Saxe said of land armies that the whole secret of their drill and all that of war is dans les jambes, busting the legs. This expression, apparently obscure, envelops a profound and sensible meaning, and may be applied with still more force to the operations of naval armaments. Let me command the fleet superior in its sailing and equal in force to beat the enemy. I learned with regret that the vessels of war built at Kherson became rotten in general at the end of 6 years. This seems to me more extraordinary, as before the present war, France got excellent timber for building from the Dnieper for the king's yards at Toulon. It is said that the Admiralty of the Black Sea spends enormous sums yearly. I cannot vouch for the correctness of the statement, but I know that the fleet does not look like it. In Denmark, where order and economy prevail, persons entitled to credit have informed me that it costs the state but $5,050,000 Rix per annum to maintain a fleet of from 25 to 30 ships of the line, with frigates and other small vessels in proportion, and for 1,000 seamen in regular pay. The ships of war built at Copenhagen last 16 years without requiring any repairs of consequence. My respect for Prince Potemkin, who created the fleet of the Liman, makes me regret that it should have been built on false principles, unable to sustain its enormous artillery or to maneuver properly on the Black Sea, while the Turkish fleet crossed it at its pleasure. The commerce of the Black Sea is an object of great importance, but this commerce, so advantageous to Russia, will always be annoyed and often interrupted by the Turks, till Russia has a stronger fleet in the Black Sea to hold a rod over them, and to place the keys of Constantinople in the hands of the Empress. Russia, having all the requisite materials in making the necessary arrangements with order and economy, without speaking of war, to avoid exciting suspicions in powers jealous of your glory, this deficiency might be supplied in a few years. The means of obtaining good seamen is to create a merchant trade, to form an alliance with the United States, and to have a squadron of evolution on the Black Sea directed by an admiral and a properly instructed staff. I always believed that Russia requires a port on the Asiatic side opposite the Crimea to protect the fleet from flaws of wind and currents and to be, as it were, a sentinel post on the Turks. I've thought of Sinople for this purpose, and I spoke of it to the Empress and Prince Potemkin. But being better informed, I found a more suitable situation where I am certain such a post could be securely established at small cost and burn the whole Ottoman Empire. This place is a peninsula between Sinople and Constantinople. I must be permitted to conclude my journal with some reflections naturally suggested by matters affecting my personal honor. I have never been able to conjecture the reason which made Prince Potemkin order Admiral Mordvinov to give up to him the official account of our operations, which I had drawn up in conformity to the orders of the Admiralty of the Black Sea, as I was sure he had done, both by Admiral Mordvinov and his brother-in-law, his wife's brother. No more could I guess why Prince Potemkin had given orders that no notice should be taken of my loss of the frigate Alexander, which was run aground in the battle of the 17th of June. This information also I had from Admiral Mordvinov after I had given up to him the command of the squadron. I was assured by him that this frigate was in consequence always retained on the list of the Marine. When I found that I received no testimony of the satisfaction of the Empress with my conduct in this affair, and on other occasions very interesting to the Empire, I was compelled to think that she had been ill-informed, for her ambition is to be esteemed the most magnanimous and the most generous of all sovereigns. I received a letter from the Minister of the United States to the Court of Versailles, dated Paris, the 23rd of March 1787, which began by telling me that a letter he had received from me dated at St. Petersburg the 21st of January was the only proof my friends had of my existence since I had left Copenhagen. If I had played the part of a cipher in the campaign of the Liman, it was for the first time. I either deserved to lose my head, or the plans of the operations on the Liman, which had been got up in St. Petersburg during the winter, and which I saw with astonishment in the office of Monsieur Popov, ought to be burned. I assert that they are false even in the most trifling details. I have acted a public and distinguished part for 15 years among an enlightened people, where the press is free, and where the whole conduct of every man is open to discussion and subject to the judgment of his fellow citizens. No man can play the hypocrite during so long a period in a career so trying as was mine. I was natural for the Prince of Nassau and Brigadier Alexiano to be my enemies, for they both sought only their own advantage, and Prince Potemkin, who knew better, erred in judgment in placing me in competition with them. But how happened it that I had around Prince Potemkin other enemies as powerful as they were malicious? I ought to have found only friends in Russia, for I have served that empire faithfully and well. The manner in which Prince Potemkin has changed in regard to me since the commencement of the war exceeds all imagination. While he supposed at first that my services would be an acquisition in directing the maritime operations against the Turks, the admirals Mordvinov and Vainovich entirely lost his confidence as officers, and it is evident that Vainovich had not regained it on the 19th of August, when it was proposed that I should go to Sebastopol to take command of the fleet. When I had the misfortune to offend Prince Potemkin by the freedom of my letter of the 14th of October, he sent several couriers which carried entreaties and brought back refusals, begging that Admiral Mordvinov would take command of the squadron, which the latter only at last accepted on condition of receiving carte blanche and insisting that the prince should not interfere in any arrangements he thought fit to make. I have mentioned that the Dnieper was frozen over the day after my arrival at Kherson. In consequence, the squadron and flotilla were placed in danger from not having been properly secured for the season after the departure of the Captain Pasha. I understood that some of the vessels were lost in the Liman, and that the Vladimir, to save herself, was obliged to risk the passage to Sebastopol without a good part of her ballast. Briefly, in a few days after my departure from Kherson, Admiral Mordvinov was disgraced and sent from the service, whilst Admiral Vainovich, who had married the daughter of Alexiana, was placed at the head of the Admiralty with the chief command of the fleet and the entire confidence of Prince Potemkin. It is said that Russia has no longer need of foreign naval officers. So be it. No one is more desirous than myself that this may be so, for I cannot be jealous of any of them, and I must ever desire the prosperity of a country I have served. I may, however, be allowed to observe that this opinion is not very old. If it had been believed before the last campaign, why were my services so anxiously sought after? Assuredly could not have been in compliment to me, or in order afterwards to make use of me in promoting certain political designs. I have frequently heard that since the war with Sweden, measures have been taken to induce Rear Admiral Kingsbergen to quit Holland and re-enter the service of Russia. His countrymen alleged that he had been offered the rank of Vice Admiral with order of Alexander Nevsky and a fixed revenue of 20,000 rubles a year, and that he refused all these advantages as he had lately married a wife with a fortune which enabled him to live in independence in his own country. It is known that the King of Sweden made advantageous offers to Admiral Curtis of the English Navy to induce him to take command of the fleet against Russia, and that this officer declined them, not wishing to hazard his professional reputation in command of a fleet which was not in so good a condition as that of England. The Empress will do me the justice to remember that when I had the honor of accepting her service, I did not say one word regarding my personal interests. I have a soul too noble for that, and if my heart had not been enlisted for Her Majesty, I would never have drawn my sword in her cause. I have now nothing for it but, like Admiral Kingsbergen, to marry a rich wife, but I have sufficient to support me wherever I choose, and I know enough of the world to be a philosopher. When I arrived at the Black Sea, if reasons much stronger than those which withheld Admiral Curtis had not influenced my mind and heart, which were devoted to the Empress, I would never have hoisted my flag on board the Vladimir. I would have refused the poor command offered me, and which was in no respect worthy of me. I have never puffed my own actions, nor given any piece to the press containing a eulogy on myself. I respect the names of Kingsbergen and Curtis, but the first duty of a gentleman is to respect his own character, and I believe without vanity that the name of Paul Jones is of as much value as theirs. It is 30 years since I first served, and I had for friends and instructors a d'Orvilliers and a Pavilion. Unfortunately, Prince Potemkin never gave himself the trouble to know me. I had the happiness to be loved by my officers and men because I treated them justly, and set them a good example before the enemy. After I seized the command, though the campaign only lasted a few days, the seamen soon found the difference. They said they had lost their father. They were served with mouldy bread and afterwards with spoiled meal. I have mentioned that Prince Potemkin had promised in presence of Admiral Mordvinov to advance the officers under my command and to restore to them the seniority they had lost by the promotion of the officers of the flotilla, that he has not kept his word, and that in consequence my officers, to the number of 50, have demanded their dismission. No one of them offered to resign while I had command. Admiral Voinovich, having represented to Prince Potemkin that without these officers the fleet was useless, he was compelled to advance them all. I have been told that they were not yet satisfied, as they were not restored to their seniority, and that they proposed to quit service at the end of the year. I hope justice will be done them, for they are brave men. For myself, I have been marked among all the officers that served in the Liman, being the only one who obtained no promotion, though I commanded and was alone responsible. I may be told that I ought to be satisfied with having received the rank of Rear Admiral on entering the service. I reply that I could not have been offered an inferior grade. One officer may deserve as much in a day as another in a lifetime, and every officer ought to be advanced according to his merit. I was not favored in rank on entering the Russian service. I had a full right to claim that which I accepted. A man only 24 years of age has since been received into the service with the rank of a major general. I wish to say nothing against this officer. It is not always years that give skill, much less genius, but he must do a great deal before he has my experience. It is painful for the honor of human nature to reflect on how many malevolent and deceitful persons surround the great and particularly crowned heads. I speak from my own unhappy experience. Some persons had the malice to make Prince Potemkin believe that I made unhandsome strictures on his military conduct, and ridiculed his manner of conducting the siege of Achakov. I have heard much idle talk on this subject, and I am aware that it excited considerable discontent in the army. I was told during my illness at Kherson that 1,000 of his officers had demanded their dismission, but I defy anyone to say to my face that I ever allowed myself to criticize his operations. I have been strongly attached to him, of which I think I gave proofs during my command. And even after he unjustly superseded me. Witness my letter of the 27th of October, at a time when I certainly had reason to complain of his conduct towards me. I have been more deeply hurt by those secret machinations against me as regards the Empress. My enemies have had the wickedness to make her believe that I was a cruel and brutal man, and that I had, during the American War, even killed my own nephew. It is well known that from motives of revenge the English have invented and propagated 1,000 fictions and atrocities to endeavor to blacken the character of the celebrated man who effected the American Revolution, a Washington and a Franklin. Two of the most illustrious and virtuous men that have ever adorned humanity have not been spared by these calumniators. Are they now the less respected on this account by their fellow citizens? On the contrary, they are universally revered, even in Europe, as the fathers of their country, and as examples of all that is great and noble in the human character. In civil war, it is not wonderful that opposite factions should mutually endeavor to make it believe that each is in the right. And it is obvious that the party most in the wrong will always to be the most calumnious. If there had really been anything against my character, the English would not have failed to furnish convincing proof of it. For with very slender means, I had been able to give more alarm to their three kingdoms during the war than any other individual had done. I have heard that at the period of my entering the Russian service, the English in St. Petersburg cried out against me and asserted that I had been a contraband trader. All the world knows that men of this description are actuated entirely by avarice, and every one to whom I have the honor to be known is aware that I am one of the least selfish of mankind. It is known to the whole American people. I have given proofs of it not easily shown, of which I possess very flattering testimonies. In a letter written on the 29th of November 1782 to Congress by Mr. Morris, then Minister of the Marine and Finance Departments, after having made my eulogium with the warmth of a true patriot who thoroughly knew me, he said that I had certainly merited the favor of Congress by services and sacrifices the most signal. Men do not change their characters in these respects. If my heart has bled for the Americans, above all for those shut up as victims in English prisons by an act of Parliament as sanguinary as unjust, if I have exposed my health and life to the greatest dangers, if I have sacrificed my personal tranquility and my domestic happiness with a portion of my fortune and my blood to set at liberty this virtuous and innocent man, have I not given proof sufficiently striking that I have a heart the most sensitive, a soul the most elevated? I have done more than all this. So far from being harsh and cruel, nature has given me the mildest disposition. I was formed for love and friendship, and not to be a seaman or a soldier, and it is I have sacrificed my natural inclination. As an officer, I loved good discipline, which I consider indispensable to the success of operations, particularly at sea, where men are so much crowded and brought into such close contact. In the English Navy, it is known that captains of ships are often tyrants, who order the lash for the poor seamen very frequently, and sometimes for nothing. In the American Navy, we have almost the same regulations, but I looked on my crew as my children, and I have always found means to manage them without flogging. I never had a nephew, nor any other relation under my command. Happily, these facts are known in America, and they prove how cruel and harsh I am. I have one dear nephew who is still too young for service, but who now pursues his studies. Since I came to Russia, I have intended him for the Imperial Marine. Instead of imbuing my hands in his blood, he will be cherished as my son. In short, my conduct has obtained for me the returns most grateful to my heart. I have had the happiness to give universal satisfaction to two great and enlightened nations which I have served. On this I have received singular proofs. I am the only man in the world that possesses a sword given by the King of France. It is to me a glorious distinction to wear it, and above all to have received it as a proof of the particular esteem of a monarch so august, a monarch who has become the protector of the rights of the human race, and who adds to this glorious title that of a citizen. I have indelible proofs of the high considerations of the United States, but what completes my happiness is the esteem and friendship of the most virtuous of men, whose fame will be immortal. And then a Washington, a Franklin, a D'Estaing, a Lafayette think the bust of Paul Jones worthy of being placed side by side with their own. It is then certain that this is not the bust of one, etc. Since I am found too frank and too sincere to make my way at the court of Russia without creating powerful enemies, I have philosophy enough to withdraw into the peaceful bosom of friendship. And as I love virtue better than reward, and as my greatest ambition is to preserve, even in the shades of retreat, the precious favor of the Empress, I may tell Her Majesty that even in the midst of my persecutions, my mind was occupied by plans for the essential advancement of her service, of which I gave some idea to her minister in June last, 1789. I have not entered into any detail, for these are politicians who before now have robbed me of my military plans. I have other projects in view from which the flag of Russia might derive new luster, and which would cost by little to Her Majesty at the outset, and perhaps nothing in the end, if I had the direction, for I would be able to make war support war. We have already done it in America, and our Marine has cost the United States nothing. At all events, I have the satisfaction of having done my duty in Russia, and that without any views of self-interest. It is affirmed that in general, strangers who come to Russia are adventurous in search of fortune, not having the means of living in their own country. I cannot say as to this, but I at least hope that the Empress will not class me with those. Briefly, I am satisfied with myself, and I have the happiness to know that though my enemies may not be converted into friends, my name will nevertheless be always respected by worthy men who know me, and it is to me a satisfaction and a signal triumph at the moment of my leaving Russia that the public and even the English in St. Petersburg, with whom I had no connection, have now changed their sentiments in regards to me, give me their esteem, and regret my departure. St. Petersburg, July 29th, 1789. Conclusion. The art of war deserves the exclusive attention of those who are to be engaged in it, and military science is only acquired by dint of duty, of reflections, and of combinations. This study, commenced at an early season, constantly follow up during life, and aided by continued experience, will hardly become familiar in all its parts to him who pursues it. Some occasion will infallibly happen when pungent regrets for having neglected to obtain instruction will be felt in all their force by him who, being charged with an important operation, is obliged to confess to himself his own incapacity to execute it. The time has gone by beginning to attend to such study, when he has unfortunately been promoted to a command. Birth, patronage, solicitation, intrigue sometimes win employment and rank, but they do not secure success and credit. As the profession of arms is so honorable, and those who hold commands require reputation at once so brilliant and so solid when they discharge their duties worthily, and as, on the other hand, nothing is so disgraceful as a repulse received in war, though our own fault, with what honor should not officers who have any passion for true glory seek to provide themselves abundantly with all the variety of knowledge which may some day put them in the way of becoming distinguished? Courage alone will not lead to renown, as many fondly believe. The road would be too easy. The fate of courage, devoid of lights which a knowledge of the principles of art communicates, is to be ignorant of danger, to confront it, and to perish to no purpose, often even without the satisfaction in perishing of knowing that the manner of its fall was intrepid. It would appear that the study of an art, of which all the details are so interesting, the knowledge of which is connected with an infinite number of facts naturally exciting quick curiosity, the principles of which are scattered through the histories of all nations, might have inspiring attractions for those who desire to rise in their profession as high as they are permitted to hope for, and a taste for it which cannot be run down to their advantage by conducting them through the true path to the promotion they covet. Such promotion cannot be flattering to men of sense unless they have the satisfaction of knowing that they deserved it, and the consciousness is of itself sufficient to console those whose success calumniators have made it their business to prevent. Thus ends the Rear Admiral's own account of what happened in the course of his engagement in the Russian service. John Paul Jones left Russia and arrived in Paris in 1790. He was still receiving pension as a Russian Rear Admiral. John Paul Jones made several attempts to re-enter the service in the Russian Navy and even visited St. Petersburg, but the Empress did not grant him an audience. The war between Russia and Turkey ended in 1792. Turkey was defeated, and the Treaty of Yassy was signed on the 9th of January 1792. The territories west of the river Dnieper, including Hadji Bey, modern-day Odessa, and Achakov, ceded to Russia. To commemorate the siege of Achakov and success of the campaign of the Liman, Prince Marshal Grigory Potemkin established a Russian city Nikolaev on the southern Bug. Crimea was recognized as an inalienable part of Russia. John Paul Jones died in Paris in 1792. On the afternoon of the 18th of July, when 45 years old, he consigned himself to the inevitable, and assisted by the governor Morris, drew up his will. A few hours afterward, while laying in bed, his great spirit quietly departed. John Paul Jones was buried at St. Louis Cemetery for Alien Protestants, which was later abandoned. In 1899, General Horace Porter, United States ambassador to France, resolved in his own expense to find the body of John Paul Jones. 6 years later, the body was found. Jones was buried in a lead coffin filled with alcohol. The body was about 5 feet 7 inches in height, with brown hair and high cheekbones. Both French and American scientists gave positive identification as that of John Paul Jones. In 1805, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered to bring the body back to the United States. On the 17th of April 1912, in the center of Washington, D.C., a monument to the father of American Navy, John Paul Jones, was erected. In January 1913, the Rear Admiral's remains were finally placed to rest in a bronze and marble sarcophagus at the Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis.